All right. Well, welcome everybody to the third webinar in our Middlebury School of the Environment webinar series called The Stream. We're really excited to have you all here. As you know, The Stream is a webinar series provided by Middlebury School of the Environment, which is a 6-week summer program that focuses on environmental science and environmental studies and leadership development, hoping to develop the next generation of leaders in the sustainability field. And we have some super exciting news. We've just decided that our next summer's program for 2022 will be operating in Monterey, California at Middlebury's campus in Monterey. It's going to be an awesome program focusing on sustainable development, leadership development, hopefully some marine biology, and of course, always a heavy dose of storytelling and environmental communications and digital media development. Today, we have an awesome webinar lined up. We have one of our closest friends and an instructor from the Middlebury School of the Environment program in the past, Alex Nickley, who is now a program coordinator at Duke University in the Asian and Pacific Studies Institute. Hey, Alex, we're super excited that you're here. Alex is a really close friend and we worked together for years, and he is an amazing birder and naturalist. And we asked Alex to lead a webinar today about his experiences birding around the world, but focusing on Yunnan province, China, as well as his experience in the United States and elsewhere on his travels. I gotta say, like, Alex is one of the most intrepid explorers of the world that I know. And he is fearless in his travels and his exploration of the natural environment. So we're really excited to hear what you have to say, Alex. You've done amazing work for Middlebury and the School of the Environment and the language programs. You set up bio camps for Chinese students all across China and lots of other things. And we're excited to hear about it. So the floor is yours. Educate us.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'll do my best. Huge thanks to both you, Kurt, and CLEO, my mentors and close friends from Dali and Kunming and the School of Environment. So yeah, I'm just super happy to be back and to share a little bit about my peculiar lens, I guess, that I adopted in China, and to talk a little bit about birding and also more broadly about Yunnan province, which was my home for some 4 years when I lived in China. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. Just 1 second here. Okay. Can you all see that? Okay, great. So yeah, the title is Adopting a Peculiar Lens, Seeing Place Through Birding in Yunnan. So here's a couple lenses to just get us started. Okay, so the talk of this title is somewhat misleading, although the peculiarity of someone standing in the street staring for minutes on end up at a tree with binoculars. The bird is often hidden from sight by most of the passersby, sometimes pishing to make the bird emerge, sometimes frantically reaching for one's phone to record a vocalization. That's fairly apt, fairly peculiar indeed. But the suggestion that birding was my sole lens to see the world around me while I was in Yunnan is false. Plus, of course, birding requires 2 lenses, the left and the right parts of the binoculars. But the point I wanted to get across is birding can tune you into a layer of the world that is often overlooked. It is that layer, one interconnected part of the tapestry of life, that I want to focus on today. When you bring it into your field of vision, you can greatly enhance your awareness of place, and you will begin to seek places, both big and small, that you otherwise wouldn't. Scientists call these places habitats, and they can be found just about anywhere you might be, even in large metropolises like Kunming, the city I called home for 4 years between 2015 and 2019. But before I start, perhaps I should introduce myself and how I came to live in Southwest China and how I got into birds. For the latter part, the description on my eBird portfolio describes it fairly succinctly. My brother introduced me to birding during one winter back in Ohio. I couldn't believe the riot of life flitting above me on the icy branches. Anyone familiar with Ohio knows how dreary winters can be. You can go months on end with overcast skies, freezing temperatures, and not much snow to cheer you up. So what is one to do? How about find a little patch of woods and look carefully for the abundant wildlife hidden in plain sight? Steely gray titmice with wispy crests, charismatic little chickadees with their black caps and chins and bold white cheeks, tiny winter wrens with stubby cocked tails prowling in the fallen logs, and elegant warblers with bright yellow rumps chupping above you to see if you'll notice them. Encountering a winter foraging flock for the first time is pure magic. Out of the bleak of winter emerges an array of vivacious life dancing on the branches right in front of you. I probably went out looking for birds every day that winter, and I've been hooked on birding ever since. The story how I came to live in the beautiful southwest region of China is a little bit more complicated and hard to describe. I guess it really starts with me learning the language in college, or should I say, begin my long and at times arduous journey of learning Chinese that has progressed for nearly 10 years now, and really there's no end in sight. My first trip to China was on a scholarship to study language in Suzhou back in 2009. I could hardly speak a coherent sentence at that time, despite already having 2 years of collegiate Chinese under my belt. In fact, I remember the director of the program assigning dorm rooms to us in Chinese shortly after we arrived on campus. He gave me my key, told me my room number, and left me to my own devices. 尼克利107, 尼克利107, Yao? What's Yao? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yao? What's Yao? It turns out Yao is an alternative word for one, which is pronounced E in most other circumstances. I walked around for 10 minutes trying hard to hide the fact that I could not even understand the digits to my own room. I was going to be in for a tough time that summer, and truly I was. It wasn't until my second trip to China that I came with binoculars in tow and a new method for unlocking the secrets of the city. I moved to Kunming with my partner and 1-year-old son in 2011, earning a living as so many foreigners do in China, teaching English. At that time, I was still fairly new to birding and had not yet been adequately acquainted to even the common birds of Southwest China. Everything was new. Although Kunming is a densely populated city of 6 million or so people and vast stretches of concrete, there were, to my delight, birds to be found in those green interstices of the urban landscape. Even now, some 10 years later, I can recall certain bird encounters that are inseparable from place. One of the first birds I ever identified in China was, of course, the Oriental magpie robin, hopping around the lush vegetation of our own xiaochu, or private neighborhood, in the garden nestled between high-rise apartments. To my astonishment, I would also find other migrating birds use that specific microhabitat, including the radiant blue whistling thrush, a bird of mountain streams that was drawn undoubtedly to the water features of that garden. When you begin to encounter wild animals in such a setting, the possibilities of the city truly expand. I started to realize that just about anywhere you could find pockets of green, or even just open areas, whether open sky, water, or ground, you could find birds. I mean, we're talking wild animals here. Although I had some magical moments finding birds during that first day in Kunming, it was not until returning several years later, after graduate school and much more intensive Chinese language, mind you, excuse me, that I really came to learn the city's avifauna and its secret spots for harboring resident and migrant birds. Although there are lots of bird stories to tell, for the sake of this talk, I feel I should first discuss Yunnan University campus. Colloquially known as Yunda, Yunnan University is a relatively small and historic campus near the heart of Kunming. It's where I worked for 4 years with CET and Middlebury College, And it's a place I cut my teeth identifying Kunming's fantastical beasts and where to find them. As a green oasis in the center of a fairly substantial urban jungle, Yunda provides crucial habitat for an astonishing array of bird species, mostly those passing through during spring and fall migration. But to find them, you need to adopt a certain lens. Yes, there's the binoculars, but also a way of looking at the physical space and its potentiality. Finding habitat. This way of looking at the world, if I can put it like that, was emergent for me. That is, like most good things, it came slowly, and I learned as I went. I would be wandering around campus looking and listening for birds and gradually discover slight microhabitat associations. Or maybe I should say I found microhabitats and then discovered the associations. Enter microforest, aka Moshu Sanling. The most iconic building of Yunda's historic campus is called Yuan. Built in the French colonial style, it sits on top of a hill looking out at Green Lake Park, the site of the mayoral dwelling some centuries ago. And I'm sorry you can't see it in the image here, but it's very close to this statue. There are steps leading up to the building. And on either side is a forest. Now, this may sound strange to those familiar with Chinese cities. Forest? You mean a patch of trees, right? Certainly not a forest, but it is forest. The canopy structure is complex and the plant diversity is significant. These are the only true pockets of forest on campus, and as I would discover, they are essential spots for finding rare birds. I spent many enjoyable hours in that forest, unbeknownst to most visitors to campus who would not see the strange Lao Wai or foreigner with binoculars hopping the ledge and entering a different realm. It was curiosity, or perhaps possibility, that first took me in there. It was the bird encounters that kept me going back. Here's the notes from one of my first significant observations. Small tan thrush or robin, orange legs, dark bill, thin white eye-ring, white throat and undertail covert, scaly brown spotting on breast, light undersides, maybe slight rufous on primaries, quickly bobbed behavioral, short tail. I went back to my office to consult a field guide after seeing this and another unidentified flycatcher in the Musca Kappa complex. After looking at the plates, I realized I was almost certainly looking at a lifer robin, most likely the highly coveted Siberian blue robin based on the scaly breast. I decided I had to try to get a second look. Patience and skulking in the Yunda microforest along the main outdoor stairway worked. I not only got to see the female, but also a bright blue male with a snowy white breast. And that's what we see in this image. Now, if you're not actually there viewing these amazing wild animals in the middle of a dense and highly populated urban city, it might be hard for you to understand my excitement. Nevertheless, these observations that accumulated over time ended up giving me a temporal sense of the city as well. That is, they help me understand the comings and goings of migratory birds according to season. Birders in the US, of course, have this down and they have tons of data to refer to. But for me in Yunnan, it was very much a learning progress. Okay, so microforest is an easy one. Now, I guess I should show. Here's some data of the birds that I recorded on Yunda's campus. And you can see in April and in May and October, especially, there's big spikes in these migratory birds. And that kind of maps out what is the spring and fall migration through the city of Kunming. The bottom graph is white-tailed robin, which you can see here. Okay, so microforest is an easy one. Birds like forests. Find the patch of forest, find the bird. Well, yes, that is good advice generally. But lots of my finds at Yunda were not in the microforest. My daily peregrinations around campus took me to nooks and crannies where no one, no human, ever bothered to venture. And it is in these quiet places that I found many incredible birds. And yes, I named these microhabitats. Sekirkus Corner, Flycatcher Alley, Gardener's Grounds, Underground River, Philoscopus Orchard, etc. Take Sekirkus Corner, for example. This is basically an old majestic willow with an understory of plant species abutting the art building in the archive storeroom. That structure, that habitat, and perhaps particularly those plants and their associated macroinvertebrate community provided refuge for an astonishing number of migrating species, including those in the charismatic Securgus warbler complex. And here's a picture of a Securgus warbler nearby that patch with bamboo, as you can see. In that corner, I also found Asian stubtail, yellow-throated flycatcher, and a very unexpected and one of my personal favorites, chestnut-headed Tesia. I mean, come on, look at that thing, it's so cool. These are very good finds with little to no previous records in Kunming, at least to my knowledge. And to my surprise, I also found one day in that very spot, bird trappers who had an eye for structure and habitat where rare birds might turn up. I guess you could call that traditional ecological knowledge. And then there's much more unlikely spots like Underground River. And I don't have a picture of this, unfortunately, but it's a small channelized ditch 20 feet underground from an academic building cut out of a slope, a place you would never expect to find birds, maybe cockroaches. But it was exactly in this spot where I found 2 new species of wagtails that had never been seen on campus before, undoubtedly due to their strong water associations and that small ditch that was in sort of in that location. Or the north wall of the university that sits adjacent to a recently demolished middle school. The newly created open space of that empty lot attracted the attention of a common kestrel, a small falcon, possibly searching the open space for mice. Okay, but I'm digressing a little bit here and focusing too much on birds and less on the lens. Looking carefully for niche habitats opened a whole new world of patch birding for me on Yunnan University campus. It taught me more broadly about the migration patterns, and it taught me the crucial elements of patience and persistence while birding. But above all, birding Yunda taught me to see the potential of space, even those elements of which are small and often overlooked. Often, see Leo, I changed. All told, I have 117 species on that campus recorded. When I first started, I never would have imagined that would be possible. It also encouraged me to explore the city more broadly. Many in the audience are aware that China as a country has been going through several massive transformations over the past couple of decades, including the largest scale mass migration of humans in history. This migration has largely been one-sided, that is from the villages to the cities. In this context, cities like Kunming have been expanding, while sleepy villages in adjacent areas are gobbled up by urban development. The amorphous border between the village and the city, sometimes referred to as the peri-urban fringe, is constantly shifting. It is in these dynamic areas of underdevelopment, or more aptly, impending development, that I look for birds. And thus the wastes become oases in a way. But enough of Kunming for now. Yunnan is a large and mountainous province that holds nearly half of China's biodiversity. And that's with only a little over 4% of the country's total land area. You have tropical rainforests in the extreme south of the province in Sichuan and frigid tundra on the mountaintops of the northwest that abut the Himalayas and reach close to 7,000 meters. Rapid elevational changes means concomitant variations in climate and vastly different plant communities. This means great variation in species assemblages, even within geographically small areas, like a mountain ravine. And of course, bird diversity is just astonishing. So once I tuned my eye to the niches and interstices of the city, I was ready to explore habitats in more remote areas, such as this one. And this is an image from Tibetan Yunnan, a little village called Hongpuotsuen, where I spent some time with my brother out there birding and also developing programs. That is another part about the lens of birding. It helps you focus in on the details to see those things right in front of you that you never noticed before. But it also broadens your view by taking you to brand new places. And I feel I should note here that the places birding took me in Yunnan also broadened my view of this culturally diverse province and indeed China more generally. I owe no small amount of my cultural experiences to birding. Language, however, and I can't forget this, was certainly a necessary tool in all of this. Okay, I was going to stop and show you a map of Yunnan and some of the places, but I think I'm going to skip that for now. Okay, so let's go westward to the bi-autonomous region of Dali Prefecture. And this is a picture from Dali, actually where the School of Environment ran its program for several years. So I spent many months in Dali over the course of my time in China, mostly in the historic village of Xizhou. This is Xizhou, to the north of the ancient walled city. I guess it's not entirely fair to say that the birds brought me to Xizhou, as there were certainly many other pull factors, but it is the immense natural beauty, not disconnected from the culture and the history of the place, that kept me going back. Dali is in many ways the ideal spot for birding. In the valley of Dali proper, you will find one of China's largest freshwater lakes that attract many overwintering waterfowl and provides habitat for numerous wading birds. Next to the lake is a substantial plain with a patchwork of small farms interspersed with scenic villages like this one. Then, of course, there's the Azure Mountain, or Canshan, just to the west of the plain, rising some 4,000 meters above sea level. In one rather enthusiastic day of birding these three sites, I logged over 100 species of bird. Through the lens of birding, I was able to access fallow fields and small mountain streams in new ways and uncover some of their mysteries. So here's just a few of my lenses in Dali. Fields of Xizhou. This one. But my birding adventures did not stop in Dali, however. I was fortunate enough to make several trips to more remote locations within Laojunshan and Baimashuishan, two snow mountains to the north that contain vast swaths of old-growth forest and habitat for the highly endangered Yunnan snub-nosed monkey. This was mostly in my role scouting and developing Middlebury's global partnership for sustainability with the Nature Conservancy. But of course, it was my birding, or more broadly, naturalist tendencies, that got me further down the trail. I recall being out with a group of 7 rangers that collectively spoke 6 different languages and represented 5 different minority groups: Bai, Yi, Lisu, Tibetan, and Naxi. Lisu was the lingua franca among this group of knowledgeable rangers who were kind enough to revert to Mandarin when I was involved in the conversation. The mountains of Yunnan are not just havens for biodiversity, but the homes of people from diverse cultural and linguistic groups that depend on them for their livelihood. In fact, the first blood pheasants, and I don't have a picture of one, unfortunately, but they're beautiful birds, that I ever saw was pointed out to me far down a ravine on a moss-covered log by a ranger who spotted them with no help from binoculars at all. Similarly, birding at Baima got me out further and looking closer, not just at birds, but also everything in the woods and its connection with the village. They don't have a picture of the village, but we'll rest on this one for now. Xiao Yu, a Lisu woman who worked at the small conservation lodge there, shared with me some of the situated cosmologies that intertwined with the landscape. For example, the smaller mountain, or the Shenshan, that abuts the village is sacred and serves as a protector for the local Lisu people. Villagers summit the mountain at least twice each year to pay their respect. Although I was awed by the beautiful birch hemlock forest with massive rhododendron understory, it was this cultural connection that grounded my sense of place even more. And of course, the wonderful home-cooked meals, steamed buns with honey harvested from the mountain in the morning, with a more mild version of yak butter tea, and the chats by the hearth at night. Sometimes I would hear stories on the road too. For example, on one windy trip back down the mountain from Baima, our driver pulled over to take a look at the trunk of a van that carried a freshly slaughtered pig, the various cuttings of which were on display and for sale. At that point, a man dressed in a bright scarlet button-up shirt, I'll never forget it, walked up and clutched the pig's lung in his hand for further examination. From what I could gather from the ensuing conversations, the man was on his first trip back to the village he was exiled to during the Cultural Revolution some decades back, where thousands of youth were sent down to the countryside to be reformed through hard labor. He suffered tremendously, no doubt, during that time. In fact, I heard him talking about almost dying of starvation while laboring in those very mountains. Maybe he came back to the mountains to seek some sense of closure after all those years. So lots of stories in the mountains of Yunnan and lots of interesting history going on too. So don't just look at birds if you ever go there. But for now, let's turn back to birding. The two most renowned birding hotspots in Yunnan lie in the mountains several hundred kilometers to the south of the Baima and Laojun mountain ranges. One is on an ancient caravan road that you can see here that passes across the Galigongshan mountain range, a global biodiversity hotspot. Known as Baihualing, or Hundred Flowers Ridge, this place came into view solely due to birding, although I did not just appreciate it for its birds, certainly. Once an obscure and remote village, Baihualing is now bustling with Chinese tourists, mostly from major East Coast cities who, like me, were drawn to the birds. The villagers there have developed a very successful business model of renting out blinds, or niaotan, as they're called, to the city slickers who are seeking the perfect shot of birds they can sometimes identify and sometimes can't. Although I could not resist peeking into these blinds from time to time, no charge if you don't have a camera, I spent the vast majority of my time hiking the ancient caravan road, which took me into one of the most spectacular natural settings I have ever been to. The habitat changes. Oh, here's a sign for the niaotan. As you leave the small village from the coffee fields and walnut groves to the vast forested slopes, at the lowest elevations, you truly feel like you're in the tropics with broadleaf evergreen forest and lush streams and impressive waterfalls. But as you ascend in elevation, you meander your way through what seemed to be a virgin forest, that is, a forest that had never been cut. These towering trees shelter many different microcosms in the understory. Sometimes bamboo, sometimes mixtures of lush forbs. You never know what's going to be around the corner. And of course, the tree communities change as you climb higher from mixed deciduous, then deciduous coniferous, and then mostly coniferous to open mountain meadow swaying in the breeze. And that's on the east-facing side of that mountain range. After summiting, one is encountered with an entirely different world. For climatic reasons, the West Slope has wholly different plant community that is referred to as a coral forest. Stunted and twisted oaks and many other species, I'm sure, are covered in lichens and all variety of epiphytic plants, displaying a unique palette of bright colors accentuated by gray bark and gray lichen. Moving through these worlds, both east and west, one is greeted with a stunning variety of bird life, including some of my all-time favorites. And I think we should just pause here to look at some of the birds. So this is a red-headed trogon, long-tailed broadbill, and none of these photos are my own. These are all from the Cornell lab, and the citations are on the bottom left. Cutia, this is a Himalayan specialist that is kind of like a nuthatch. One of my favorites, fire-breasted flower pecker, actually reminds me of my brother for some strange reason. Lady Amherst pheasant. The pheasants in China are just amazing. So many endemic species. And these are shots more from Yingjian, which I probably won't have time to talk about today, but this is a hornbill. Orange-bellied leaf bird, definitely found at Baihualing and Galigongshan. And then, of course, the Tesias. There's 3 different species of diying or ground warblers, really tiny warblers that just run on the ground among the forbs, looking for insects that they can forage. Really cute birds. So birding Baihualing in winter when the climate is mild and the night sky is clear and bright with shimmering stars probably can't be topped. And I mean that. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a better spot anywhere in the world than Baihualing to hike and find birds. And if you use your birding sensibilities to look carefully and listen, you will also be rewarded with stories of the past and hints of the village's future. Without birding, among other things, I never would have had the privilege to explore these places big or small. The peculiar lens of birding enhanced my sense of place and greatly deepened my appreciation for Yunnan, its diverse habitats, and milieu of fascinating cultures and contested histories. So that's the end of my formal talk, but I do want to thank a few people. So fortunately, while I was working in study abroad, I had numerous advocates who supported my birding adventures and, more importantly, allowed me to incorporate my passion into my work. I would like to use this opportunity to thank some of them. Kim Sine, Adam Jones, and Tara Vanacore at CET, and all the others there that appreciated my bird dailies. Jack Byrne, especially, and Liz Ross and Bill Mayer at Middlebury. Li Rong, Li Chunhu, Li Li at MIC Kunming. Brian and Jeannie, of course, of the Linen Center. Wu Qingyi as well from the Linen Center. May Braverman and Michael Chen from Princeton in Asia. Steve Trombulak, CLEO, and of course, Kurt Gervich from Middlebury School of Environment. I would also like to reserve my deepest thanks to all the wonderful local birders and environmental practitioners that I befriended along the way and learned so much from. This includes, but it's not limited to, Bai Haotian, Li Xiaolan, Liao Haohong, Zhou Yaxing, Conway, Shi Lihong, Zhong Tai, Zhang Zhiming, Xiao Yu, and the rangers at the Laojunshan station, and so many others. Also, I owe a huge gratitude to all the people I shared meals with, hitched rides from, and conversed with out on the informal birding trail. And last but not least, thanks to my partner, Yunnan, who got me into Yunnan in the first place, and for having the vision to start up our highly successful winter biocamps. My son Arbor for being patient with his bird-obsessed father, and of course my twin brother Ben, not only for introducing me to birding in the first place, but for his constant support and companionship. And I think Ben's in the audience today, so hi Ben. All right, I'll stop the share now. Thank you.
Wow, that's awesome, Alex.
I feel like you say, this is my favorite bird on every picture.
I mean, how can you pick with so many cool birds, right? It's hard to pick one.
We've got lots of time for questions from the audience. You could write them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that they get to Alex. Alex, oh, and looks like Benjamin Nickley says, awesome talk. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks.
I am curious, Alex, in is there a significant birding infrastructure in Yunnan in the way that there is in the US and elsewhere, like websites where you can go and post your images and tell other birders where to go to see a rare species, and conferences and things like that?
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely tapped into some of those when I was in China. And I really owe, I guess, some serious gratitude to Bai Haotian, one of my best birder friends in China, who added me to WeChat groups, got me involved in sort of local bird competitions, I guess they could be called, which I did a couple of times, just friendly birding outings with other students at Yunnan University. But yeah, of course, there's tons of bird researchers in China, just like in the US, conferences that focus on birds and biodiversity more broadly. But yeah, if you're just a birder, especially a foreign birder who's a visitor to China, I mean, I think the best thing you can do is get to know some locals that are sort of tapped into those worlds and those communities. That's easier if you have some Chinese under your belt. But yeah, it's really people on the ground who sort of got me involved and really showed me some of the best spots to travel to and shared their knowledge. Like, you know, Bai Hualing, I think that's a spot that Hao Tian first told me about. I went birding with him and a couple other friends to Yingjian, which is another great spot I didn't have time to talk about, but more to the south west of Yunnan. That's very tropical. I mean, you can see parakeets, just a whole different community of birds that are more closely associated with Southeast Asia there. Just really amazing. And yeah, I only knew about that spot and was able to kind of figure out the logistics first by going with some of my local friends. So, yeah.
Cool. Are you I guess my next question is, are,
Oh, sorry, Kurt, can I add to that? I just thought of something else.
yes,
So in terms of the birding infrastructure, this is really interesting. So I mentioned the bird blinds that are set up at places like Baihualing. Those things also exist in Yingjian, the spot that I just mentioned, and various other places, I'm sure, across Yunnan and China more broadly. So this has really become an industry almost where local villagers adopt this as part of their livelihood strategy. You know, using biodiversity and specifically birds to really market their village and the place where they live and to attract tourism. I mean, this is essentially ecotourism, right? And increasingly year by year, there's just more and more people from large cities that are getting interested in, I would say, bird photography much more than birding in a traditional sense. And this is really interesting. In China, I think there's a pretty stark divide between bird photography and birding. And you don't see that as much in the United States, but in China, at least from my own limited perspective, my own observations, a lot of the older folks, and typically older men from big cities have, you know, very expensive equipment, big lenses. They really care a lot about getting that perfect shot and sharing it on social media, but they're not as much into hiking and just seeing a bird for the bird's sake, or identifying birds, or racking up a life list as some birders do. They don't really get into that quite as much from what I could see. Typically, the hardcore birders that I noticed, at least, tended to be younger. And there seemed to be a bit of a generational divide there, but this is all expanding and it's all growing very rapidly. And it is in many ways transforming some of these more remote villages that are in just, you know, stunning natural landscapes. And, you know, we could have a discussion about the pros and cons of that. And I think it's highly interesting, but yeah, the infrastructure is growing very much with sort of the popularity of birding in China.
there are a couple of questions in the chat, I think from Ben. I don't know if you can see them. The first one is, can you compare birding in China to the US for you? How is it similar and how's it different?
Yeah. Okay, so I mentioned some differences. But yeah, just thinking back, well, birding in China for me is just far more interesting because all the things I talked about, I mean, these places you go to are just so interesting culturally. The natural environment where I live in North Carolina, which, I mean, it's beautiful, it's great, there's lots of awesome places, but it just pales in comparison to places like Yunnan. I mean, if I had to wager a guess, I would say Yunnan probably has more biodiversity than all of the United States and Canada combined, probably much more. And so, you know, when you're out hiking, I mean, it's just stunning. You know, just the plant life, the animal life, the things that one encounters, the village life, out birding in Yunnan. It's just, yeah, it's just mind-boggling. It's just fantastic. So in that sense, birding in the US is much less interesting. But in terms of like birding culture, I think, well, you know, people come into birding from all different walks of life, and they can approach it in very different ways. And I guess being a bit of a lister, or someone who likes to keep records of the birds I see and kind of do a little bit of the patch birding or racking up species, doing big days and stuff. I've met a lot of basically birders who are very, very extreme, and they kind of, it's very much a part of their identity. And it forms almost entirely their social life in the US. You know, who they interact with, who they're friends with, what they do, and, you know, anytime they have free time, it's about listing birds or recording birds. There is that subset of the birding population. And I would say that portion of the birding population in the US, and I would not consider myself part of that, I'm not that extreme, is much larger and more active than it is in China. It does exist in China, but it's much, much smaller. So that's one thing. And just birding in general is much more popular in the United States. But I think, that's changing a bit. The popularity is increasing, as I mentioned. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's many more differences, but I guess I'll leave it at that.
When in China, when you're going out for a big day. Oh, sorry, Leo, go ahead.
I want to ask a question. Mostly, I think Alex is quite unique in terms of you speak both languages and you have been birding extensively in both countries. I mean, one of the difficulty I have here is when I find a friend who can go birding with me, he will be popping up words like vocabulary. I was like, huh, what? and it's so hard to get vocabulary, especially I noticed that some birds are named after the person who first identified them. And that doesn't make any sense to me, not knowing that part of history. And in Chinese, the name of the birds are usually, red breast, yellow top, those make more sense to me. So I wonder if you have any recommendations for people who are trying to bird in the US, not knowing the language and feeling very frustrated and discouraged in many cases.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm going to answer that in two ways, actually. One, maybe that you're kind of looking for. One, I'm kind of going to go off on a bit of a tangent, if that's all right. So, how can you get familiar with bird names and have a good time when you're out with your birding buddies if you're not familiar with the names and the language? Well, get a field guide. I mean, get a field guide, learn the bird names. That's one thing. And yeah, I'm totally with you with the birds that are named after people and things like that. That's a lot harder to remember than if the names like describe a physical attribute. But yeah, there's no way really to get around that. You just got to learn your birds. But the other thing I want to comment on with that wonderful question is this whole idea of naming birds after people. So if I were to pull up my Birds of Southeast Asia Princeton field guide, and that's the field guide I use for birding Yunnan, rather than Birds of China. But if I were to pull up either field guide, I would notice so many cool birds that are named after, as you might have guessed, European, basically, imperialists, for lack of a better word, but explorers, scientific explorers, who name birds after wealthy contributors or supporters in Europe and elsewhere. So like Lady Amherst's pheasant, that's a good example of a bird that's named after someone in that position. But there's so many, and actually there's a bit of a movement in the United States, probably in China as well, to rename species of bird, to kind of name them with names that are more grounded in the locality, or resonate more, the English names resonate more closely with the the name of the bird in the local language. And even there's some conversation about changing the Latin names, which often carry the names of these personas. So yeah, I'm all for that. I think, yeah, a lot of these names should be changed. And if they're descriptive of the birds, that's great. I think it would be cool too if the names are changed so that maybe they acknowledge in some way the indigenous cultures of the places, especially for endemic birds. I think that would be really cool too. So.
Yeah, I just put a link in the chat that everybody can check out. That movement is gaining a lot of traction and is now about renaming birds that have been named after colonialists and slave owners in the United States, or named after locations where essentially kind of genocide occurred, right? Death and destruction, elimination of indigenous peoples or slaves. And that's a great movement that should be, promoted. And yeah, these would be great to have the names of these birds be educational about the birds themselves and the places where they're found.
Yeah, I totally agree. I also want to say though, to Leo's question as well, I had to learn the bird names in English and Chinese, because when I'm out with my Chinese birding friends and I'm like, oh, it's a Lady Amherst pheasant, or whatever it is, Siberian blue robin, I'd be really excited, and they just they might not have any clue what I'm talking about. So yeah, I learned pretty quickly that just knowing English names was not going to be good enough for me. And I did learn many of the bird species Chinese names as well. And the Chinese names are so much cooler, I think.
I agree.
Generally speaking, yeah.
So actually I have a question about that, Alex, because you're right. So like Siberian blue robin, right? Is that in any way related to American robin? Is it part of the thrush family? Like, are the names at all? I mean, we should be using scientific names, I guess, but birders don't. Birders use common names.
Yeah.
Why is that? And should we be moving to scientific names?
No, I mean, well, I'm going to show my ignorance a little bit. You know, I actually don't know the relationship of the robins. They might be called old world robins, or, you know, the robins that you would see in China and Southeast Asia. I don't know the relationship of that to, say, the American robin. If I had to guess, I would say, you know, they're vastly different genera, and not closely related. But yeah, if I could get my twin brother Ben to jump on, maybe we can make him panelist and he could describe this. But yeah, I'm not actually sure
We
what
can have him talk.
evolutionary relationship is between those. But in terms of should we be using the scientific name? Oh my gosh, that's going to make it Leo's job a whole lot harder. You know, if she's already, and for anyone, right? I think people should refer to birds in any way that they want, and in, you know, any language that they want. Yeah.
Hello.
I just allowed Ben to talk, and we do have a question from Matthew Hayes coming in. So after Ben's comments, we'll jump to his question.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ben.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. On your video, or?
I'm on my phone because I'm like
Okay.
riding my bike and I'm on a rail trail, so I don't even know how to do that on the Zoom app on my phone. Otherwise I would. But yeah, so Latin names they are useful in that it's binomial nomenclature, and they describe evolutionary relationships. So you have like genus and then species. And if you go further up the hierarchy, you get into family and things like that. So a lot of the names of birds, like with robin, for example, you know, in the old world, there's all these European robins. And when early ornithologists, naturalists, explorers, and things like that came to North America, and they saw birds that resembled some of their, like, you know, common European birds they're familiar with, they gave them similar names. So they saw an American robin, like, oh, that kind of looks like that robin we had back in England or whatever. And so it gets the name robin. Sometimes those species are evolutionarily similar. They're from the same genus or the same family. But in this case with the robin, they're not actually related. They're not closely related at all. So it can get a little bit confusing there with the common names, because common names don't necessarily describe evolutionary relationships. That is like how closely related things are. So yeah.
That was a great answer. You're on your bike now, Ben, and that's your answer?
I'm sitting by my bike right now. I'm not riding it. That would be even more great. Yeah, if I were doing no hands and yeah, wind flowing through my hair. But thank you.
Thank you. Let's get to Matt's question. He said, thank you for an interesting talk, Alex. I have no knowledge of birding, but I know that in the US, many birders conduct their work in national parks or preserves. Can you say anything about how issues of access to private government-owned natural spaces in Yunnan played into your birding experiences?
Yeah, that is a great question, Matthew. Thanks for asking that. And Matthew's one of my colleagues at Duke. Yeah. Oh, wow. Gosh. How does private property and land tenure work in the US and China? Maybe Leo is much more, well, I'm certain Leo is more qualified to answer that question than I am, but I guess I'll just speak from my experience. Oh gosh, I might reveal that I actually trespass quite a bit when I'm birding in the US. But yeah, there's a difference. So a lot of the birding hotspots that you see in the US are definitely going to be on public land, and they're going to be accessible to the general public, right? Whether it's a state park, a county park, a nature preserve or whatever it is. A lot of the hotspots are located in those areas, but certainly not all of them. In China, I guess if I reflect a little bit, yeah, there were several areas that certainly were not within a nature reserve, but were just out basically in the mountains in villages. Well, I guess some of them might be they might have some level of protection. They might be in a designated sort of conservation area, whether that's at the, the national level or more commonly the provincial level. But it doesn't really have the same kind of gated feeling, I guess I would say. The way that, these protected areas are run in China, it's a bit different. There's a lot more people living in those areas, which I think is how it should be. That's great. But there's also some problems with parks, reserves being paper parks, and a little bit a lower level of protection for, say, endangered species and things like that. That can get a little bit sticky because you want to protect, the rights of indigenous people. I mean, Yunnan is highly, I guess in China, they would refer to these people as ethnic minorities, but they're indigenous people that have been living, in those mountains, in those places for many, many generations. And it's hard to, tell people what to do and to prevent them from carrying out their traditional livelihoods on one hand. And then on the other hand, you have the whole endangered species situation. It can get really sticky. But yeah, I guess that's only kind of touching the surface of your question. Maybe Leo jump in.
Well, if you talk about the land tenure situation, I actually just had an interesting discussion with my students in my urban planning class, comparing land tenure in the US and China. In China, technically, all land is publicly owned. Nobody really legally owns anything. And in the countryside, it's more of a collective ownership. So the village would own the land. So the concept of trespassing is not even a real thing in China, unless you climb over someone's backyard wall or fence into their backyards. That's kind of invasion to home, but outside any fences, usually it's considered public land. You can go in. So the trespassing issue is not really an issue in China. So wherever you go birding. I don't think anyone, unless they're suspicious about your foreign white face, they usually don't drive you away. I've never experienced being driven away, unless it's clearly marked as protected nature or off limits to tourists. Those locations, maybe you don't want to go in. But it's that's really very different from the US, having a private big piece of land where your family go hunting and you put on signs of no trespassing, so don't accidentally shoot someone else. But in China, you don't have the luxury of a person or a family owning a big piece of mountain or, and then for their own hunting purposes. That's really not the case mostly.
Yeah, I just want to add to that too. So like when I think back about my time birding in Xizhou, like birding the village and the surrounding farmlands, a lot of farmers, they might not technically own it. It might be state owned, and technically they have a 70-year lease of that farmland or whatever it is. But, I still very much consider it their land, I guess. It's different. Like, yeah, of course, it's not just theirs. It's the birds and it's the plants and it's everything. But, it's definitely theirs in the sense that they depend on it for their livelihood. When I'm out birding those places, if someone gives me the vibe that like I shouldn't be there or, tells me to leave, which almost never happens. Usually people are just very welcoming and friendly and just are curious like what I'm doing with binoculars. But if they didn't want me there, I would certainly turn around and leave. And then the other thing is a lot of these protected areas, especially forested areas, even, by Hualing, Places in Yunnan, huge nature reserves that are protected at the national or provincial level. A lot of them do not have formal trails. The trails that they have are foraging trails that locals know, but if someone like me was just to go out trekking on those trails, I would get lost very quickly. There's a lot of intersecting trails. If you're not with someone who knows that landscape intimately, you're going to get lost. And so that's a difference between the US, like, right, if you go to a state park or a national park, there's well-marked, there's signage, there's well-marked trails everywhere. A lot of the places in nature reserves in Yunnan, that's not the case. Some of the bigger ones, they do have a couple major trails that are just packed with tourists, but as a birder, that's not a place you would ever want to go. And so you end up finding, you know, more obscure sort of remote places, often connected to villages and things of much more interesting, honestly. But yeah, that's another difference.
So Alex, we just have a couple of minutes left, and I would like to hear, you know, one of my favorite things to do or to watch, I guess one of my favorite things to watch you do is introduce somebody who's never been birding before to birding. Because you're so good at it. And so I am wondering if you can describe, like, what's your process? What do you think are the important things to do with somebody who's never been birding and you have the chance to take them out and it's 5 a.m. in the morning, and like, what do you do now?
God, I don't know if I even want to get out at 5 a.m. in the morning here in the US, but in China, sure. Yeah, what do I do? Really, I think it's about being enthusiastic and just letting your passion kind of shine through. It's hard for me to do that on this webinar talk, sitting in front of a computer, you know, indoors at Friday after a long week of work on the computer. But, you know, if I'm out in the field and, you know, we're in a beautiful landscape, I'm just going to freak out with every cool thing that I see. And I think that's what really gets people into it. And yeah, if I could just share a picture here real quick. I had a couple other pictures I wanted to show, but like this, like I did when I was in China, I did a lot of stuff with like local kids. Some of that was connected to like the Middlebury program, some of it not. This wasn't. But I'm out with Shirley Hong. She's a very well-known, in the pink here, she's a very well-known environmentalist, and her husband's a very famous nature photographer, Xi Zhinong. But I'm out here with her organization, Xing Zhongguo, just like hanging out with school kids and getting them to bird their backyards, right? Like the fields of Dali. And they, yeah, if you're excited, they get excited. Like if you get a scope on like a zishuiji, like a, you know, purple swamp hen, or I guess a gray-headed swamp hen, and you just freak out and, oh my gosh, it's so awesome. Look at that, check that. Like they get into it, and they realize how special that is. And yeah, for me, like just being like a nature nerd and a naturalist, like I freak out at like the smallest thing. Like I'll see like a true bug or something like that, and just go nuts. I mean, looking at the pattern, and I just want to know everything about that little critter. And I think if you just have that personality, or you have that love and respect of these things, it's very easy to kind of share that with others, and especially with kids. And I think it's an important thing to do. So yeah, I guess, did that answer the question?
Nice. Yeah, absolutely. Right. That seems like your trick.
Can I add something quick to that on the other side, which I'm the one that Alex actually, I was the first time I went birding was with Alex. And I have to say that his passion and enthusiasm really affected me, but it was really frustrating when he keeps saying, you know, look at the birds and then puts the binoculars to your eyes. And that never worked for me because I just couldn't find anything. I couldn't see anything. And it was really frustrating until he put out that spotting scope and I saw that purple swamp hen. I was just really just jumping around this. Once you see one, I think that does the trick. to get into the field. I think there was another thing I learned from after I got back here was another friend who does birding is, Alex, you're so used to field guide. Me, new birders have no idea how bird guide works. I was looking at it. It was not arranged alphabetically. There was no way for me to get started when I see a bird that looks like this and that. I just can't find it in that field guide. And there's no way for me to find a way to that section until a friend told me this is not arranged by alphabetic, it's arranged by different types of birds. You need to first know the shape and know what different types of birds, and then that's how you use your field guides. You need that a little bit later before you could use that field guide. It's not automatic. It's not like I get a field guide and go to the field, I can find what the bird is called. I can't. There's so many pages.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there is a bit of a learning curve. Yeah, totally. But I think the best approach to that is like, just go out somewhere easy to find birds and just go enjoy birds. And, if you can't distinguish this warbler from that warbler, especially like Philoscopus warblers in China, you don't have to worry about it too much. Like, you will build those birding sensibilities as you go, and you'll get a sense for size and shape just as you go, just getting out in the field and looking at, beautiful animals. So, yeah.
And Ben just said local guides help narrow it down. Yep. That's
true. And actually, Ben and I created a local guide for Xizhou, the 50 birds of Xizhou, with that intent in mind, right? Helping people who are just getting started, like, narrow it down. Because if you look at field guide birds of China, it's like 1,200 species or something. You look at birds of Southeast Asia, it's some crazy number as well. And so, that can be a bit.
I got the birds for the Northeast, still a lot of birds.
Yeah, which is great, right? That just goes to show the crazy biodiversity out there. But yeah, it's helpful to have a local guide to narrow things down.
So there is one last question in the chat, I think also from Ben, it looks like, and we'll let this be the last question. The question is, how deep does the interest go for bird photographers visiting blinds in China? Do people make the connection to habitat, like you mentioned with your experience? So I guess that's about, what one thing that really stands out in your birding, Alex, is that you aren't just identifying birds and then checking them off a list, that birds are your lens for studying the natural environment in general. And you're noticing the habitat around that bird, where that bird occurs, and the other complex of species that occur there, predator species and prey species, and, all kinds of things, and disturbance. And that is a cool way to kind of broaden your lens on viewing the natural world. And I think is that common? Is that uncommon? Do you see that in China? And you've birded in other parts of the world also. Do you see it around the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think just like anywhere, it's kind of a mixed bag, and it just depends on the individual, how they approach birding, how they approach, what lens they're adopting. It's not always, the same lens that I've kind of shared with you all today. So yeah, it's definitely, on an individual basis. But in terms of the blinds that I see, I guess, the people that I see in there, it seems like they basically, to get the shot of the bird that you want, and to, photography is a skill, and it's an art, and it's well beyond my skill level, but it takes a lot of effort to get that perfect shot of that bird. And that's great. That's not really something I'm into, but people who are really into photography, I think that's their goal, is to kind of capture that beauty. And of course, if they can rack up a species list or whatever, that's probably good for them too. But it's to kind of capture that beauty and to share that beauty with friends and family and on social media and things like that. So I think that's more the goal of people who visit blinds and spend hours on end in blinds. I noticed that people who visit the blinds, they will also go on a little hike or or whatever. Some birds will not come to the blind, so they're kind of forced to seek them elsewhere. But I mean, very literally, it limits you, right? A blind is like you're looking out a square and you see a square of forest, and that's it. And often the birds are baited with fresh cut fruit or with mealworms or things like that. So the interactions you're seeing are staged. In fact, the whole thing's a bit of a stage. And so because of that, I think the photographers miss out on the ecology side of it quite a bit. And of course, they're not seeing a lot of these, habitat differences. They're not going to be able to make or distinguish habitat associations. Bird behaviors that you're just not going to see at a baited blind, and lots of serendipitous things you can just see out on the trail. You're not going to get that sitting in a blind. So it's just a different kind of approach, and all people have their own way of doing things. But for me, I guess, I just way rather be out on the trail and taking it all in.
And honestly, I didn't know what a bird blind is until just now. I was just Googling. I have absolutely no idea. Did you see any of them in China anywhere? I've never seen these.
Oh yeah, I mean, you should go to Baihualing next time you're in Yunnan, and you can see. So basically, I should have had a picture, but basically, it's almost like a little box tent. It's basically, I think it's plastic mesh, and then a very basic frame that's like a box, and then there's a series of stools that are on the inside, and there's a big rectangular cutout sort of window where you can view the habitat immediately in front of this blind. And the idea is that when you're in the blind, the reason it's called a blind is because, the birds are blind to you. They don't really notice you when you're sitting in there, I guess. But yeah, so they're at places like Baihualing, every 20 meters or so along the main road that gets you to the ancient caravan trail, you're going to have a blind, and each blind is sort of owned by a family, one of the families of the local villagers there. And they collect a fee for people to use the blind to make use of basically their farmland or their orchard lands that sort of has a lot of sort of natural habitat kind of mixed in there as well. It's sort of agroforestry. So that's kind of how it works. And I think it is really good for the villages in many ways. And I guess you could make the argument that it's really good for the birds and bird conservation in many ways. But there also have been some problematic things that have arisen due to the blinds and the baiting and the lengths at which people will go to get the photograph that they really want. So it's not a perfect system, but it's definitely a fascinating thing, and something I wanted to research for a PhD project back in the day, but I'd rather just go birding, honestly.
Are there bathrooms in that, or it just have to be out?
No, it's very, very makeshift, very basic.
Well, Alex, it's been super fun to see your pictures and hear you talk about birds again.
Yeah, no, it's awesome to be back, and I wish the School of Environment the best of luck moving forward. Hope it works out for Monterey, and I hope you're back in China sometime in the next year or two to come. So it's been a real privilege and pleasure to work with all of you and Middlebury and School of Environment. It's just been a blast. So thank you.
You too, and give Yunnan and Arbor hugs for us.
Yeah.
Will do.
Visit them in the winter, see the snow.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. We should plan something.
We should.
And thanks to those of you who've joined us. It's been a great presentation. Thank you, Alex, so much.
Thank you.
All
right, and we'll be in touch with the next episodes in our webinar series. So stay tuned.
再见.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Chinese do pretty good.